Welcome one, come all to a beautiful show. It's gonna be awesome and some other stuff. Dee-dee-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee. Some other musical stuff.
This is special session for the week ending Friday, January 24th, 2025. I'm Brian Schott, managing editor of Utah Political Watch. This week on the show, it's week one of the Utah Legislature, and we're coming in hot. We must build. Spencer Cox lays out his agenda for the next year. Lawmakers want to make it even harder for citizen ballot initiatives. It's union bustin' time. Let's fix vote by mail by removing the by mail part of things. And I'll explain why I'm suing the Utah Legislature. My guest this week is former Republican strategist Reed Galen. He's a co-founder of the Lincoln Project. We talk about what to expect from the second Trump administration and the need for pro-democracy movements and how to resist rising authoritarian movements. Remember to subscribe to this program wherever you get your podcasts. If you leave a rating and review, it just helps more people find the show. You can sign up for my newsletter for free at utahpoliticalwatch.news. And if you'd like to support my work covering Utah politics, you can become a paying subscriber. Okay, that's out of the way. It's time to dig into this week's news. Thursday night, Governor Spencer Cox delivered his fifth State of the State address, and it was fine. I mean, it was certainly better than last year's speech where they handed out t-shirts that said, "Keep Utah weird," like nobody was going to notice that he stole a tagline from Portland. It was certainly better than that, but it wasn't a barn burner. It wasn't one that we're going to be remembering for a long time. In fact, I don't think we really remember many State of the State addresses. There are none that stick out for me, and I've been doing this for a long time. But anyway, the main theme of Cox's speech was that Utah must build. We have to build houses for our growing population. We have to find a way to manage growth, which is something that lawmakers have been talking about forever. When I first started covering politics, Envision Utah was new, and they were trying to figure out how to manage growth in the state. So this is not a new thing, but Cox does have a point. Utah's population is growing. It's expected to grow very fast, one of the fastest growing states in the country. And so lawmakers have to do something to address this growth. And here's how he made that point.
And my friends and fellow citizens, if there is one thing you take away from my remarks tonight, please let it be this simple refrain: we must build. Scripture and the 60s pop band The Byrds tell us that to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. Now is a time for building.
I really wish that politicians and elected officials would just take half a second and either think about the lyrics or think about the song itself before they use it as a prop to endorse whatever policy that they're pushing. He's referencing the song Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds, and that is a song written by the famous leftist folk singer Pete Seeger. And I really, really doubt that Pete Seeger, who intended this song to be a plea for peace during the Vietnam War, I really doubt that he would endorse an idea to build housing on public lands, which is one of the things that lawmakers tried to do with that lawsuit that was turned away by the Supreme Court. So just take half a second and think about the song or think about the lyrics before you use them with your campaign. I'm asking you, I'm begging you, everyone who uses Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, have you listened to the lyrics of that? How about Fortunate Son, which Donald Trump used on the campaign trail all the time? Did you take half a second and think about the lyrics? I'm asking you, I'm pleading with you. I know it's an easy connection to make. I know it is an easy point to make. It is lazy speech writing, but take half a second and think about it before you use it, because it is just so grating to hear that. The second thing I'd like to talk about is towards the end of his speech, he used a couple of phrases that were really weird, really odd. See if you can pick them out here.
Built here means rejecting conflict entrepreneurs who would weaponize our attention and energy and destroy that which makes us special. Built here means supporting the free people of Utah in finding their own way to build, whether it's a business, a farm, or a family. Built here means making Utah inclusive to every lawful newcomer while fiercely guarding the proven values that make us proud and peculiar.
The free people of Utah. What the hell does that mean? I mean, seriously, what does that mean? Are there the enslaved people of Utah? Are there the captive people of Utah? It's bizarre. It is such a bizarre thing. It's peacocking. It's another thing that Cox has ripped off from Florida, the free state of Florida, pushed by Governor Ron DeSantis down there. So last year he ripped off the thing from Portland. This year he rips off the free people of Utah. But the other thing he said was it means making Utah inclusive to every lawful newcomer. Those words were chosen intentionally. You may remember Governor Cox said that he would cooperate with the Trump administration's deportations. Those words are a dog whistle. Every lawful newcomer, which means anybody who's here illegally, better watch your back. As expected, a bill targeting public sector unions is kind of sort of being fast-tracked in the first week of the session, but it might have hit a little bit of a roadblock. Over the weekend, we got our first look at House Bill 267 from Representative Jordan Tusher, and what this bill does is it takes away the ability for public employees to collectively bargain with public employers. Right now, individual municipalities, individual organizations can collectively bargain, but they don't have to. So there are certain school districts, local education authorities who do collectively bargain with teachers, but there are others who do not. In Salt Lake City, the police and the firefighters collectively bargain with the city to come up with a contract. This bill would take that away. There would no longer be any ability for public employees to collectively bargain wages and benefits. This hearing was held on Thursday afternoon. Needless to say, there were a lot of people very interested in this. They had to open up 3 overflow rooms in the Capitol to accommodate all of the people who wanted to talk about this bill. Now, this bill does not specifically single out the Utah Education Association, but it's really difficult not to think that this is a reaction to the clashes that lawmakers have had with the state's largest teachers union in the past. If you will remember, in 2023, lawmakers introduced Amendment A, which would have changed the way that public education is funded in the state. Right now, Utah's Constitution says income tax revenue, corporate taxes, all of that money can only pay for public education, higher education, and some social services. And Amendment A was going to open up that constitutional earmark so that lawmakers could tap that revenue and put it to other areas of the budget. When lawmakers voted to put that amendment on the ballot, the Utah Education Association remained neutral, which was a big deal for lawmakers because if you had the UEA opposing that bill or that amendment when it first came out, there would have been a lot of problems. So they said they were going to remain neutral and try to work on the language with lawmakers in the 2024 session. 2024 session happens. Nothing happens with the language. The language stays as it is. It was very vague. It didn't make any guarantees for education funding. It only said that lawmakers had to maintain a statutory framework for education funding, but didn't say what that would look like. So nothing changed in the 2024 session. Then after the session ended, the UEA came out and said they oppose Amendment A. And that infuriated lawmakers. Adding to the tensions, last year, the UEA sued the state, challenging the constitutionality of the private school vouchers program that lawmakers had passed in 2023, known as the Utah Fits All Scholarship. Lawmakers passed it in 2023, then they increased the funding. It's like $84 million right now. And what the program does is it allows parents to take $8,000 a year per student and put it towards private school tuition or homeschooling costs or any number of things with very little accountability. That $8,000, it's almost double what the state spends per student in public education. And so the UEA is challenging that in court. Additionally, after Amendment D was thrown off the ballot because it didn't meet the public notice requirements in the Constitution, the UEA also went to court saying Amendment A also does not meet those requirements. It also has vague language. And so lawmakers voluntarily pulled Amendment A off the ballot because they knew they were going to lose. So lawmakers were furious at the Utah Education Association. I've been told that the word went out that lawmakers were going to, quote unquote, crush the UEA in the first 2 weeks of the session. And that's what this bill does. That's what this bill is part of that. It passed out of a House committee yesterday, but it doesn't just affect the UEA. It also affects firefighters, police. They would no longer be able to collectively bargain. Representative Tusher said the reason he's pushing this legislation is because it levels the playing field for all employees to negotiate their employment terms, not just through the union, a one-size-fits-all thing. As you might imagine, union members were not happy. They flooded the Capitol. I said there were 3 overflow rooms. So while lawmakers, I think, were hoping to fast-track it, it came up on the House floor on Friday afternoon, but lawmakers circled it, meaning that I don't know when it's going to come back up for a vote or when it could come up for a vote in the House. This happened last year. Tusher had a union-busting bill that required unions to hold a recertification vote every 5 years, and it also attempted to eliminate the ability for public employees to use paycheck deductions to pay their union dues. That bill got out of a committee just like this one did, but then Tusher could never get enough support on the floor. So he circled it, and it sat, and it sat, and it sat, and it sat, and it never came up for a vote, and it died. Don't know if that's what's going to happen with this bill, but that's where things stand right now in this current union busting attempt. It's already insanely hard to get a citizens initiative on the ballot here in Utah, and it's even harder to pass one of them. But lawmakers took steps this week to make it even more difficult to qualify, and that's in Senate Bill 73 from Senator Lincoln Fillmore. What that bill does is anybody who wants to put an initiative on the ballot to create a new law, you have to essentially go through the budgeting process. The organizers of that ballot initiative must identify how they're going to pay for whatever law they're hoping to pass. Maybe a tax increase, or if they're not going to raise taxes, they have to identify which programs they're going to cut in order to pay this. Now, that's going to make this incredibly hard because the people who want to pass these bills, they're not budget experts, and it's going to be very difficult for them to include that information when they start presenting this idea to the public, which is kind of the point. That bill passed a Senate committee, and then it was passed out of the Senate on Friday afternoon, so it's heading over to the House. Senator Fillmore has a companion bill. It is a proposed constitutional amendment that if there is a citizen initiative that raises taxes, now remember, if you're going to put one on the ballot, you have to identify whether you're going to raise taxes or not. But if there is a citizen initiative that raises taxes, then it will have to pass not with a simple majority, but with a 60% vote. So again, they're taking steps to make these initiatives almost impossible to pass. As I said, it's extremely difficult to get one on the ballot in the first place. You have to collect a certain number of signatures, and you have to hit certain signature thresholds in most of the state's Senate districts. And then there's an opportunity for opponents to get people to take their signatures off of the petitions. So it's really, really hard. A couple of years ago, they made it so that if you were paying people to collect signatures for a ballot initiative, you could no longer pay them by the signature, but you paid them by the hour. They've done a number of things, like I said, to make it harder to put these initiatives on the ballot, and these two bills will make it even harder to qualify one, put it on the ballot, making the process for putting it on the ballot harder. And then if it has a tax increase, it has to pass with a supermajority, not just a simple majority. And all of this is a reaction to the failure of Amendment D. And if you remember that was the emergency proposed constitutional amendment that lawmakers rushed in last year to put on the ballot, which would have given them unfettered ability to override any ballot initiative. And that was part of the Prop 4 ruling, where a judge ruled that the legislature overstepped its constitutional authority when they gutted the independent redistricting statute. They put a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot that would have given them the ability to override these ballot initiatives, and that was kicked off the ballot. It was nullified because a judge ruled that the ballot language was misleading, which it was, and they didn't meet the notification requirements. So lawmakers really don't want citizens involved in the lawmaking process. They don't want ballot initiatives. They don't like them. They want to be the only ones who propose laws, even though the Utah Constitution says that all political power is inherent in the citizens, and the authority of the governor and the legislature and the judiciary flows from the people. So Senate Bill 73 is on its way to passage. I suspect that Governor Cox will sign it, and then they'll probably get enough votes to put this proposed constitutional amendment requiring a supermajority in order to pass an initiative that raises taxes on the ballot in 2026. Utah Republicans have come up with a solution for what they see as weaknesses with the state's vote-by-mail system. They just want to take away the by-mail part of it. HB 300 from Representative Jefferson Burton still allows voters to get a ballot through the mail, but if you want to return it, you can't put it in the mail to send it back. You would have to bring it to a polling place in person so you can show your ID. House Speaker Mike Schultz has seized on some legislative audits. There was one that showed that maybe 2 people who were dead might have voted in the 2023 election, and they're investigating that. We don't know where the status of that is, but because of that, he wants to completely scrap this vote-by-mail system, which has been working very well. This is just a byproduct of President Trump's lies about losing the 2020 election to Joe Biden. He repeatedly claimed without evidence that there was massive fraud in that election, and that's why he lost. House Speaker Mike Schultz buying into it hook, line, and sinker. I really don't think that Schultz is an election denier. I think he wants to run for governor in 2028, and he doesn't want to get crossways with the Republican base who does believe this stuff. There is a significant portion of Republican voters in Utah who do believe that the election was stolen. There was massive fraud in the 2020 election, and that's why Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden back then. But if you look at public polling, the attitudes about elections have completely flipped. Republicans now have a lot of confidence in elections. And why? Because Donald Trump won in 2024. But what Republicans want to do is, in the name of reforming vote by mail, they want to take away the by mail part of it, which makes it harder for people to vote. So watch this one, HB 300, as it moves through the process. Now let's talk about some real problems with elections. Lawmakers advanced HB 69, which would prevent county clerks from looking up voting records for political purposes. If you will remember, in 2024, Utah County Clerk Aaron Davidson, who is an election denier, he 100% believes in claims of a fraudulent election, that vote totals can be manipulated. He looked up how a number of elected officials in Utah County return their ballots either through the mail or in person, and HB 69 would make that illegal. It's kind of shocking that it's not illegal already, but that's what HB 69 would do. So this is one election reform that actually makes sense rather than fixing something that isn't broke, which is the vote by mail system. On Thursday, a House committee took up the first bill of the session attacking transgender people in the state. It is from Representative Stephanie Grecius, and what it does is it mandates students living on campus at public universities here in Utah have to stay in areas assigned to their sex at birth, and the transgender community says that that is an attack on them. Recently, you may have come across a story about a resident advisor in a dorm at Utah State University who happened to be transgender. There was a social media post which the mother of one of the students objected to that, and they had to find new housing, new living accommodations. I don't know if it's a response to that, but a couple of people who testified in favor of the bill were the family of the people who objected to having a transgender resident advisor living around their daughter. That bill made it to the House floor on Friday morning, but it was circled, meaning it's delayed. There's a couple of things that you need to pay attention to with this legislation. I thought it was noteworthy during the public testimony that at least 3 people who spoke in favor of the bill brought up the executive order signed by President Donald Trump that said women are biologically female and men are biologically male. Here are some of those comments.
Our new U.S. president on his very first day delivered a decisive and clear message. There are only 2 genders, male and female, and called an executive order defending women from gender ideology extremism, restoring biological truth to the federal government. It is time for Utah leaders to stand up and do the same.
This bill also amends Title 53, which contains an absolutely incorrect definition of biological sex. And it doesn't matter whether anybody or everybody in this room disagrees with that. In fact, it is in direct conflict with the carefully and accurately defined definition of biological sex, which is in President Trump's recent executive order, and as we speak, is being drafted into legislation by the White House Office of Legislative Affairs into a bill that will probably become a law and the law of the land. So Utah may as well better go ahead and line up with this definition soon.
There are only 2 sexes, and that all Utah statute must be brought in line with this biological reality. Utah should have always been leading out on defending this immutable truth, and I'm sorry that we haven't been.
That's fascinating because it's just an executive order. It's not legislation, hasn't been passed by Congress. But here are people already demanding that the state fall in line with this executive order from Trump. Now, you may have seen people making fun of this executive order because it defines sex as starting at conception. And well, that means everybody in the United States is female because all human embryos develop along female lines until later on in development. The second thing to pay attention to is who testifies in favor of these bills. It's the same people over and over and over again. There were 9 people who spoke in favor of this bill on Thursday, and 5 of them were people we see at the legislature testifying, giving public comment all the time. We saw Gail Ruzicka, who's the president of the Utah Eagle Forum. She has been an influential figure in Republican politics for years. Delane England showed up. Delane is one of Gail Ruzicka's top lieutenants with the Utah Eagle Forum. She's on the executive board, and she hosts a podcast called the Liberty Moms Podcast. It is a far-right, conspiracy-laden podcast, but she does get lawmakers to come on all the time. It's part of a group called the Loving Liberty Network, which offers a constitutional study course. By the way, Delane England said that she is a certified instructor of the Constitution, whatever the hell that means. I have no idea, but if she's using this course, this constitutional study course from the National Center for Constitutional Studies, you really have to wonder about those qualifications. That group, the National Center for Constitutional Studies, used to be known as the Freeman Institute, which was founded by ultra-conservative author Cleon Skousen. And they have taught in the past that the Constitution came directly from a blueprint adopted by Moses, and that the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, violated states' rights. This National Center for Constitutional Studies has attracted a number of anti-government patriot groups like the Oath Keepers and the John Birch Society, and think about that, the Eagle Forum as well. well. Another sponsor of this Loving Liberty network that Delane England's podcast is part of is the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which is another far-right group that sprang out of the Posse Comitatus movement in the 1970s and 80s, and their members believe wrongly that county sheriffs are the supreme law enforcement authority in the United States and have the ability to ignore laws they deem unconstitutional. So that's your certified constitutional instructor, Delane England. So she also spoke. We saw Corinne Johnson. She is the president of Utah Parents United. That's another right-wing group, a parents' rights group. She was able to speak on this. We saw Max Sims. He is a Republican activist. He testifies a lot at the legislature. He's on the Utah Republican State Committee, and he's also very influential in the Utah County Republican Party. And then we saw Marianne Christensen speak. She's also one of the top lieutenants of Gail Ruzicka. There was a very funny moment when Marianne Christensen got up to testify for this bill, and you just need to listen to this and listen to the crowd's reaction afterwards.
I don't think anyone here wants to attack the LGBT community at all.
Of the 9 people who spoke in favor of this bill, 5 of them are Republican activists who speak on these kind of things all the time. 2 others were family members of one of the female students at Utah State University who objected to having a transgender RA in their dorm. Contrast that with the other side of things. There were, I think, 14 or 15 people who spoke against the bill, and most of them were people from the public who took time out of their day because this is a bill that they felt strongly on that impacted them, and they decided to come up to the Capitol. But who do you think Utah lawmakers listen to? They listen to this small group of activists who were there all the time. Those 5 people who spoke in favor of the bill, they can get a meeting with lawmakers anytime they want, and often do. Delane England, one of the things she does, there's a cafeteria inside the Senate building where they have some vending machines. She and her group of people, they sit there all day long, and then what she'll do is she will zoom in and testify at hearings from this building so she can go and testify to as many as she wants. She often has a background of the Golden Gate Bridge. She had to be in person for this because they weren't allowing Zoom testimony. So if you're wondering why the legislature is as conservative as it is, look at who lawmakers are listening to. Utah Parents United is not a massive group. It's not a big group, but they are there. Corinne Johnson, this is what she does. She shows up and testifies and speaks to lawmakers all day long. Delane England, same thing. Gail Ruzicka, Marianne Christensen, they meet with these lawmakers because they show up. And meanwhile, you have people who come up to speak on one bill that they feel very strongly about, but they don't have time to come up and spend all day at the Capitol, so they don't have as much influence. Like I said before, the people like Corinne Johnson, like Gail Ruzicka, they can get a meeting with lawmakers anytime they want. I remember there was a time, probably 15, 18, 20 years ago, when Gail Ruzicka had a key to a lawmaker's office, and she would go there all the time. I mean, you would see her literally taking a key and opening up this lawmaker's office in the basement of the Capitol. This was before we had the 2 new buildings, so it was quite a long time ago. But I remember seeing her use this office of a Utah County lawmaker constantly. So that's the kind of influence they have. They're there all the time. They talk to these people. So if you're wondering why they have so much pull, it's because they are there. They show up. If you've been following along, you know that the Republican-controlled Utah Legislature denied me a press badge to cover the 2025 session, even though I've been a political reporter here in the state, been covering the legislature for more than 25 years. The reason for the denial, they said that their media credentialing policy, which they changed just about a month and a half ago, states that independent media, blogs, and freelance journalists are not able to get a press credential. On Wednesday, I filed a federal lawsuit challenging this decision and claiming that those newly revised rules violate my First Amendment rights. I'm working with an organization out of Washington, D.C., a nonprofit organization called the Institute for Free Speech. They are representing me in this matter. And as I said, these newly revised press guidelines said that independent media, which I am, cannot get a press credential, even though last year, the guidelines for the previous session said that independent media could have a press credential. So that policy changed just in the last month and a half, which is pretty much right after I started asking about it. The policy also says that in order to get a press credential, you have to be associated with a reputable news organization, and you have to adhere to a code of ethics. The problem is, this media credentialing policy does not explain what any of those terms mean. What does independent media mean? What does a blog mean? What does it mean to be part of a reputable news organization? What code of ethics are they talking about? This lawsuit is challenging the credentialing policy as being unconstitutionally vague and discriminatory. The new rules do not define those terms like independent media or what a reputable news organization is. And what that does is it allows the House and Senate staffers to arbitrarily decide who qualifies as a legitimate member of the media. And for all intents and purposes, I'm the only person who's been impacted by these newly revised rules. The lawsuit alleges that they were targeted at me to deny me a pass to cover this session. One of the things I point out in the lawsuit is that the denial of my press credential came after a story that I wrote about Senate President Stuart Adams about his campaign finance disclosures. If you remember, Adams went ballistic when I published that story. He took to social media, and that Twitter post is still up right now. It calls me a former media member. It questions my journalistic integrity. It said this is part of a pattern of questionable behavior. At first, that post from Adams was published on the Utah Senate official Facebook and Twitter pages, but it was taken down after some people complained, and then it was moved over to Adams' personal Twitter page. It's still there. On that same day, Senate Deputy Chief of Staff Andrea Peterson, who is one of the people who interfaces with the media, she and I had a text exchange in which she warned me about the credential review process, and she dismissed me as, quote, someone who claims to be a journalist. She also then later told me I'm not a journalist and said that I lack journalistic integrity when I asked what these standards she claimed that I had not met. I asked for examples and she wouldn't tell me. These rules are really arbitrary. There's really no way for me to know what I have to change in order to comply with them. It allows them to pick and choose who gets to cover the legislature. And that's really dangerous. That is a dangerous thing in our democracy. The government does not get to say who is and who is not a reputable member of the media. They don't get to do that, but this allows them to pick and choose who gets to cover them, and there's no way for me to alter my behavior or change my publication to meet these rules that are really just arbitrary and designed to keep people that they don't want covering them locked out. When public officials get to decide who reports on them, who covers them, who gets to ask them questions, that is going to have a chilling effect on every other member of the media. They are going to tread lightly because they could have their media credential denied or yanked if they displease someone in power. And that's why we're suing, because these rules are unconstitutional. What we're asking for in the lawsuit is a temporary restraining order that will force them to give me a press badge to cover the rest of this session, which we're at the end of the first week of. So, I've already been locked out of a number of things. I will continue to be locked out of them until the court takes action, and we're hoping that they will give me a temporary restraining order. I'm not going to get rich off of this lawsuit. I'm not asking for a bunch of money. I just want to do my job. The only damages that we're asking for in the lawsuit are nominal damages in the amount of $17.91. Why $17.91? Well, 1791 is the year the First Amendment was ratified. So it's symbolic and it sends a message. And I think it's fantastic. I love that so much. We're also asking that the state pay my lawyer's fees and court costs if we win. I love the First Amendment. It's one of the things that makes America an incredible place to live. It makes it the place that it is because it guarantees, among other things, a free press, which is so important. And that's why I'm fighting back. Joining me today on the show is Reed Galen. He is the host of the Homefront podcast. He also has a great Substack newsletter by the same name. He's a co-founder of the Lincoln Project, and I've been wanting to get him on the show for a while now, and I think this is the perfect time to talk about, what we're facing over the next 2 to 4 years with the second Trump administration. Reed, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day.
No, thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
I want to get your perspective on what's happened. We're recording this on Wednesday, so it's the first for 48 hours of the second Trump administration. I knew a lot of this stuff was coming. I mean, we all knew this was going to happen, but to see it actually happen and the speed at which a lot of this stuff is taking place is really jarring. What are your thoughts on what we've seen over the first 2 days or so since Trump took the oath of office?
Well, a couple of things. One is historically, this is how authoritarian regimes act when they get into power or, in Trump's case, return to power. They learned a lot from his first 4 years, and they have put those things into place. You think of something like a Project 2025, which has basically been the policy blueprint for Trump's second term. They started writing that in 2021 or 2022. Like, they were preparing for this. The vast right-wing conspiracy, to crib a line from a former first lady, former senator, former secretary of state, is very well organized. They play the long game. They're very well resourced, and they are relentless. And we are seeing the fruits of all of that come to bear now. And so I think that a lot of this too is shock and awe. You see executive orders. Some of those will be things that they will actually push forward into policy. Some of those are purely to make people nuts. A lot of it, regardless of whether it's a bona fide policy or not, is designed to occupy the mind space of the mainstream media, what's left of the opposition, and people of the online left who are going to freak out about everything.
I think the most shocking thing that we've seen over the first 48 hours was what is essentially a Nazi salute being done at the White House. I never thought in my lifetime I would see something like that. And I know there's a lot of online discourse, people saying that it's not a Nazi salute. He was throwing his heart to the crowd. But, Elon Musk hasn't come out and said it wasn't a Nazi salute. And he could put a lot of that to rest if he were to do that. What should we make of that? Because that is something that, even 5 years ago, six years ago, would have been completely unthinkable. And now everybody's kind of at least trying to either make excuses for it or normalize it, which, again, I want, it goes to that shock and awe point you made.
Elon is the ultimate troll. In many ways, he is the yin to Donald Trump's yang. They are both ultimate trolls. He knew what he was doing. He knew the reaction it would engender. He knows that he owns, a massive media platform that allows him to say, sorry, I didn't know what I was doing, which of course only makes people crazier. But there were two things that were a result of that really speak to where we are, to your point, Brian. The first was, there were a bunch of neo-Nazis and white nationalists who are like, he did it. He loves us. We're really part of the gang now. And the flip side of that was the Anti-Defamation League completely soft-pedaling it, going, we shouldn't jump to conclusions. We don't really know what he meant. Like, the ADL, Brian, has one job, right? One job. And it is summed up in the expression, never again, which is the expression that Jews use in the aftermath of the Holocaust, which is, we will never allow this to happen again. And so to your point about the soft pedaling and the normalization, Look, the powers that be, the entrenched interests, they have gotten in line. Nothing should surprise us. And if there's anything I can say to your listeners is save your energy, save your outrage. This is the plan, right? The plan is to exhaust all of us, to make us turn away. And what I am saying is, if you want to keep your eyes and ears open, do that. But do it with the sense of every wave that comes to me, am I going to let it knock me over, or am I going to dive under a few because I've only got so much breath? And that's what I would say. It's not giving in or giving up. It's saying we are in a particular and peculiar time in American history. I have to harbor and husband my resources to ensure that when opportunities do present themselves, we can make the most of them.
I think that's a very wise statement. And to your point about the ADL's response to Elon Musk's gesture, one of the things we heard throughout the 2024 campaign was, at least in the last year, was this unrelenting focus on the danger of anti-Semitism, the danger on campuses, and we need to crack down on that sort of thing. And then when it shows up, that's probably one of the most anti-Semitic things that you could possibly do. And it's just absolute silence, which brings me to my next point. Is America ready? And not just Americans, but American institutions. Is the media ready? And I really don't think the media is ready to deal with what has happened so far and what's coming down the pike.
No, but I think that's a choice they made maybe 10 years ago now, Brian. I think, as you know, as someone who worked for a mainstream outlet for a very, very long time, they are all dying for revenue. And the quickest way to revenue is clickbait. And Trump is brilliant clickbait. He will always provide the outrage that will get someone to click on a link on a web page or on an app, right, that drives advertising revenue that allows these institutions to continue. I think there's the other part, more legacy media, specifically in my mind, MSNBC, but as an adjunct of NBC and ABC, right? They both bent the knee in their own way. They send Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski to Mar-a-Lago to bend the knee, and they make George Stephanopoulos pay $15 million for a suit that he probably would have won because Bob Iger, sitting in Burbank, said, we're going to be in the White House briefing room, right? We're going to be there, and we better figure out how to get there. And if that means that we have to do a few things to ensure that our presence is secure, then that's what we'll do. And of course, once you start down that path, as you know, Brian, you've already rationalized the decision. Well, we have to be there. And then the rationalizations continue because now it's like, well, if I'm not here, who's going to cover this? Are we going to have Joe Rogan covering it? But the truth is it doesn't matter anymore because you've already made the choice to cross over from being I don't even want to say objective or non-biased, but from one outlet who is willing to explain the truth as it is, and one who is willing to take what the Trump administration says and does at the face value they present.
A lot of the things that Trump has proposed so far or is doing so far is wildly unpopular with the public. I look at the executive order undoing price controls on drugs for Medicaid and Medicare. You look at the pardoning of the J6 rioters. There's some polling that came out on Tuesday morning that more than almost 60% of Americans disapprove of that. These are things that, plus we saw it in the lead up to his inauguration where people were realizing the things that Trump was going to do after they voted for him to become the president. What kind of opening does that create politically, either for a Democratic Party or a coalition who is opposed to these things? Is there some sort of political opening for people to rally around those sorts of things, or is it almost too late to start organizing or at least pushing back against these things?
I think it's both too late on one end and too early on another. The January 6th thing, I mean, let's be clear. What difference does public opinion make? Right? We are at the beginning of the Trump administration. We are 2 years away from the next election that might show Americans' displeasure with what he's doing. We did not see the mass demonstrations around this inauguration like we did around his first, and it's not just because it was cold. And so I think on that level, we're too late. On the other part, I think we're too early in that, we are, to use better language, we effed around, Brian, in 2024, and now we're in the finding out phase. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going to have to find out. A lot of people are going to have to go to the pharmacy in the coming weeks and months whenever, let's say, the insulin price rebounds to where it was, to find out that it's not $35, but it's $350. And they're going to go, what the heck happened? And then, what will happen is that the Trump administration will blame the Biden administration or pharma or whoever it is, but they're certainly not going to take responsibility for it. And what we have seen is that the right-wing media machine is very effective and efficient at moving their messages, and that's what they will do. And so from my perspective, that's why the work that you do and so many other people who have independent local outlets is ensuring that citizens, not just voters, but citizens understand what's going on in a rational, non-hyperbolic way. Here's what they said. Here's what they did. Here's what they did. Here's how it affects you, right? Here's what it was going to cost you on an annual basis. Here's what it's going to cost you now, right? Oh, it's the price of eggs. Well, the price of eggs are going to go up because there's bird flu, right? Do you think the Trump administration really cares about bird flu? Not particularly, right? Unless Tyson Chicken, right, says, hey, we need some help because they're a multi-billion dollar company who needs to build, raise chickens. And if they have to keep culling their flocks, then they're going to want government help, is my guess. And so they won't care unless there's some transactional reason they need to.
In the past, you've seen elected officials make calculations based on public reaction or based on what their constituents want when they vote for policies. That does not seem to be in the calculation right now because you have Congress gleefully looking at ways to cut programs that benefit the most vulnerable among us, to pay for tax cuts for billionaires that soon to be trillionaires. You see Congress threatening federal aid to people in California because they don't like their governor. Do you think that Congress is going to follow through with those things? Do you think that they're going to go ahead and do these things because they can? Or again, do you think that in the case of withholding aid to California, that's just sort of a troll move that sort of tickles the brain of people who watch Fox News because they really want to stick it to the libs?
I don't think we know yet. I would say that, a lot of the stuff that you're seeing with the executive orders and the pardoning of January 6th is going a long way to make sure that base stays in line, that those are the most angry people, right? That these people that are most supportive of Trump, ironically, are the people who are most hurt by a lot of the things that he does. The programs they rely on are federal programs, right? There's that old trope, right? Like keep your government hands off my Medicare, right? Because there's a disconnect, right? If you ask people, do you like Obamacare? I hate Obamacare. What about the Affordable Care Act? Oh yeah, I love that. Got me health insurance. But again, that's a communications issue, right? You have to have a group of people willing to communicate in a way consistently all day, every day, that explains to people what's going on in the context of their lives, not in the context of policy, but like you're getting screwed and here's who's screwing you. Right? Very plain, very basic, very to the point. It doesn't have to be hyperbolic, but it does have to be direct. And right now we're missing that key component in a lot of places. And I would also venture to say, Brian, that I traveled to most of the target electoral college states throughout the fall of 2024. And here's what I could tell you, whether or not it was in a high-end neighborhood where most people had probably gone to college or a more working class neighborhood where people hadn't, people weren't uninformed. Like they were very clear about what their choices were. Right? They're very clear about what's going on in the world. The question they have is like, why does it matter if I participate or not? Because in a lot of the places, if you're an upscale neighborhood and Trump says, I'm going to cut your taxes, great. If somebody says, I'm going to promise you this in a lower class neighborhood, a working class neighborhood, they don't believe you anyway. You know why? Because every year they look out their window and their lives don't change. So, we have a real apathy problem. I have friends who, are very politically active or at least politically attuned, and they say, I'm going to take a break. I can't do this anymore. That's a human reaction. I'm exhausted. And that's what they want. And that's why, as I said a few minutes ago, rest in this time, getting some perspective matters, because right now we are in a place where it's really hard to have any tangible way to push back.
One of the things that I really appreciate about your publication and your podcast, The Home Front, is you talk about pro-democracy movements, how people need to be pro-democracy in this time, in the face of what is a nascent authoritarian movement that has captured all three branches of the American government. For people who we hear the phrase pro-democracy all the time. Explain how people should look at that phrase, what it should mean to them, because, you know, you also hear people screaming, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a constitutional republic, to which I would say, well, what do you think the Constitution does in order for that republic? But I'm curious how you would talk to people, how you explain to people who don't, how they should look at what a pro-democracy movement or being pro-democracy looks.
Well, it breaks my heart, not just pains me. It breaks my heart, Brian, to say that that message didn't work in 2024. Democracy as a message didn't work. So from my perspective, it's not defending democracy, because defending democracy in this moment failed. We didn't keep him away from power. I would also say that I wouldn't even call it a nascent authoritarian movement. He's been around for 10 years. He was in power for 4. He's back in power now. Yeah. And whether or not it's here in Utah where we live, or up in Idaho, or, you know, most of the old Confederacy, like, these are all authoritarian states now. You know, they all have very conservative MAGA, you know, governors and statewide officials and legislatures who are going to, you know, propose and pass crazy things that will be signed by their respective governors, excuse me. And so I think now it's a matter of, you know, we have to build community. We have to build communications networks. We have to build capacity. We have to remind people what democracy is and why it matters. Because clearly, you know, if I was talking to a buddy of mine yesterday morning, and a guy who's been in politics a long time too, former Republican like me, and he said, you know, if you have to get up at 6:30 in the morning to get your kids to school, right, and you have to get them out the door, and you have to make lunch and all that, and then your day starts, and whether or not it's working for 8 or 9 hours, or, you know, if you're the parent who's responsible for caretaking, right, and you're driving all over creation to do this and that, then you get your kids back at 2:30, and you've got sports or tutoring or whatever the activity is, and then everybody gets home, you got to make dinner, you know, you get kids bathed and ready for bed and everything else, and you're not done until 10. Like, is democracy at the top of your thinking? Or is, like, how am I going to get to tomorrow, right? Is, you know, these high-minded thoughts that I care about and I spend a lot of time on, like, is that at the top of people's minds? Or is, like, no, you know what? Like, you make fun of the price of eggs, but, like, I got to go to the grocery store 3 days a week, right? And the difference between a $4.99 dozen eggs and $7 or $8.99 price dozen eggs, like, does matter to me. And I think that my biggest failure, personally and professionally, was an arrogance that I think was really the strike point of the 2024 election, which was, you know, Donald Trump is a bad guy. He's going to do bad things. And somehow, even in that, he was still able to communicate to Joe and Joan Q public that he cared about them more than the Democratic nominee did.
Yeah, I think that that's a very salient point. And, you know, you hear people saying that, you even hear Democrats still arguing about, you know, about talking down to people, trying to explain why their policies were good rather than talking to them, you know, meeting voters, meeting Americans where they're at. Do you think that I guess, perhaps some of the shock and awe, some of the realization that what Trump is going to do, does that provide an opening for, even if you don't call it a pro-democracy movement, does that provide an opening for and I hesitate to call it a resistance, but some sort of opposition, some sort of, because that's what you need in a functioning democracy. You need more than one party, you know, fighting for Americans, and Republicans were really able to convince them that they're doing this. So I'm wondering if you see an opening for that moving forward in the next 2 to 4 years, or is this exhaustion just really going to make that extremely hard?
I think it will be difficult, but I also think that if it's going to happen, it will happen locally first, you know, at a statewide level, or even at regions within state, then regionally. I don't think that, you know, if the Democratic Party is the opposition party, my experience, unfortunately, fighting alongside them for the last 5 years, is they are either unwilling, incapable, or unable to get out of the clouds and get onto the ground, if that makes sense, from a national level.
Yeah, 100%.
They're either afraid or unwilling to go against, you know, the elites and the activists in their party to try and, Brian, win elections, right? Like, when you're a young Republican operative, you know, I hail back to Al Davis from the Oakland Raiders. Just win, baby. That's all Republicans care about. to a fault, as we've seen. Democrats want to win, but they want to win because they're smarter, right? It's like being married, right? You can be right or you can be married, but you can't be both, right? In politics, you can be right or you can win, but you can't always be both. And that's not to say you have to lie. You don't have to be an inveterate reprobate like Donald Trump. Democrats have won in a lot of places. Now, I will say the advantage Democrats have, and maybe we all have, are two things. One is that American voters are incredibly fickle. So, we've been in a continuous throw the ball for a while. And second is generally they're the only other option. Now, that's not a basis for long-term success. That's just luck of the draw that this Democratic Party's been around since the founding, and they're one of two market entrants. And so I would say that, this stuff is going to have to start again at the local level, the county level, the state level. And Democrats and activists are going to have to decide how best works in their state. What works in a state like Utah will not work in a state like Maryland or vice versa. And no one should have any expectation. And I think that's one thing we're learning is Democrats had a senator in Montana until a couple of weeks ago. They had senators in the Dakotas, in Nebraska, and all of these places, in Missouri. Those are all gone now because those senators got caught up in a national Democratic ethos that said, no, you must ascribe to a certain level of orthodoxy and a certain set of beliefs of which there can be no wavering. And if you do, then, we'll give you a hard time, not support you, as opposed to saying, well, again, a blue dog Democrat in East Texas and AOC, two different things. But you know what? At the end of the day, they're probably going to vote together 90% of the time.
And I think that people can comfort themselves, and you know this because you've been in politics for a long, long time. How it is now is not how it's going to be forever. Things change constantly, and you have to be ready for that. Reed Galen, he has a podcast and a Substack called The Homefront. They're incredible. I encourage you to go subscribe. Reed, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show.
No, thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
There was something that happened on the opening day of the session that I thought was funny, but also kind of not. The Utah Senate made a big mistake when they were electing Senate President Stuart Adams. I think this is kind of indicative of Adams' leadership style, where he's been known to essentially steamroll any opposition when there's something he wants to accomplish. On Tuesday morning, Senator Jerry Stevenson's running the show, and all of the new senators are being sworn in, and then everyone who was previously elected, they also take the oath of office because it's a brand new legislative session because of the elections in November. So Stevenson opens up the floor for nominations for Senate president. And this is just a formality. Republicans have the majority. They've already elected Adams to be the president. This vote is simply a formality. So Stevenson opens up the floor for nominations, and Senator Chris Wilson makes a motion to elect Adams as president by acclamation. What that means is it's just a voice vote for Adams as president. They're not going to take a roll call. There's only one candidate. Democrats haven't nominated anyone because they were going to lose. In fact, the Democrats seconded Adams' nomination for president. But when Stevenson calls for the voice vote, something happens. Take a listen to this.
To the motion, excuse me, motion is second that we elect President Adams by acclamation. All in favor of that motion, say aye. Are there any opposed? No. I move that that motion passes. Senator J. Stuart Adams has been elected the president of the Utah Senate by acclamation. Congratulations, President Adams.
That no vote was Republican Senator Daniel Thatcher, who voted against electing Adams by acclamation. Stevenson rules that the motion passed, but it shouldn't have. Under parliamentary rules, and I understand this stuff because I'm a total dork, when you hold a vote by acclamation, it must be unanimous. It wasn't. Thatcher voted against the motion to elect Adams by acclamation. So essentially, Adams was not elected as president. But Stevenson rolled over the top of that and declared that the motion had passed. Adams took the dais, gave his opening day speech. I reached out to the Senate and said, hey, are you going to hold another vote? Because technically this was not allowed, because it was not a unanimous vote, which is what is required by acclamation. And unsurprisingly, they never got back to me. Now, while this is funny, ha ha ha, they didn't follow the rules, but they didn't follow the rules. And we've seen this from Adams before. You remember he strenuously objected to a story that I wrote that he violated state law with his campaign finance disclosures by listing a credit card company as an Amex, which is not allowed. But that was a violation of state law, but the state elections office let him off the hook. So this is just another example of Adams not following the rules for something that he wants to accomplish. And I think that this is just indicative of how Republicans run the Senate. Rules be damned. And that will do it for this week's show. Once again, I'd like to thank Reed Galen for the conversation. Subscribe to his Substack. It's called The Home Front. He's got a podcast of the same name. Both of those are well worth your time. And I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to listen this week. If you haven't already, subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts and leave a rating and review. That helps people find the show. You can do it at Apple Podcasts or wherever. We're a slave to the algorithm, and that's how the program gets suggested to more people. If there is a topic you'd like me to tackle or a guest you'd like to hear, reach out, let me know. I'd be happy to accommodate that. You can email me or find me on social media. I'm on Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Also, sign up for my newsletter for free at utahpoliticalwatch.news. Or if you'd like to make more podcasts or more journalism possible, you can support my work by becoming a paying subscriber. Independent journalism that holds elected officials accountable is so vital right now. And I love what I do, but I can't do it for free. It costs money, time, and resources. So if you are able to become a paying subscriber and help support this work, I would really appreciate that. You can do it for as little as $5 a month at utahpoliticalwatch.news. Special Session with Brian Schott is written and produced by me, Brian Schott. Thank you so much for listening to the show, and we'll be back with a new episode next week.